8 hours, 30 minutes, and 100 years ago, the war of all wars ended at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. Let's take a moment to remember all those that gave the greatest sacrifice in that war, and all those sinners in an effort to give us freedom and peace. Please be seated. Good morning.
Good morning.
Firstly, I want to thank all of you that have, and all of you that have families serving for that purpose. For those that may not know, I was born in Scotland and grew up in England, where part of the weekly school schedule was to a class known as religious instruction. It was in one of those classes that I was first introduced to today's Gospel reading. We knew it as the widow's mite. The mite in this case is not some annoying bug, but a small coin that was being placed in a collection box. A small and worthless coin to those watching, that all the widow could give in thanks for what her God had done for her. This has always been one of my favourite lessons. And the God incidents cannot go unrecognized, and that it is today that I've been asked to speak, and it's today's Gospel reading. So as I look back at my faith journey, I ask myself, can I be as generous as the widow? My journey has included mountaintop experiences, including, believe it or not, a Pat Boone Come Together revival in De Montfort Hall in Leicester as a teenager. Another one was when I made my Crucio in Tiger, De Dolores. That was shortly after coming to Good Shepherd. There have been various other moments when the love of God has been showered upon me through his servants that surround me, and I have no explanation as to why. What have I done to be loved this strongly? I guess God does love me, with no yarbars. There have been the times when I look at the single set of footprints in the sand to remind myself that I have not been forsaken, and the footprints are not mine, but Jesus's, as he carries me through the tough times. Was I ever thankful enough? The last 26 years of my life has been wrapped like a blanket with the love of the Good Shepherd family. Blessed with the lessons of those that have preached, the small groups as we've gathered throughout Park County, being part of the youth group leadership. Believe it or not, kids can teach you some things. Did you know that you can think of your faith journey as riding a tandem bicycle? It's a lot easier if you let Jesus steer. And that came from a senior Sunday sermon by one of those youth. Prior to Father Tom, there were those times that a hand would come and rest on your shoulder. And you knew you were being asked to use your gifts for the good of Good Shepherd, and by extension the surrounding community, and inevitably the next words out of your mouth were, "Yes, Father Bob." My wife showed me a Facebook post that Father Bob made this week to celebrate the 5-year anniversary of an honorary degree he received. There was one part of that citation that he quoted that resonated with me for today. Encouraging each member to find the gifts God had given him or her, and and then using those gifts in the service of the gospel, not only in the congregation, but in the world as well. That has been the mission of Good Shepherd since ground was broken over 50 years ago. Father Tubman may not place a hand on your shoulder, but with his passion, as you see him coming towards you, and you are about to be asked, what, and you don't know, and as of yet, I have had a similar response. Yes, Tom, but I still won't support Arsenal. That's private between Tom and me. This year, the uncomfortable question of stewardship has been twofold. One, meeting the annual needs of Good Shepherd, and two, the capital K campaign, so that Good Shepherd can not only grow as a congregation, but expand its ongoing mission to the world beyond the borders of Ellsworth and Ted. The questions still remain the same. What are the gifts you have to offer? What are the gifts I have to offer? What are the sacrifices that you can make, or I can make? So I will leave you with this thought from the Gospel reading. Regardless of your gift, be it a mite or something greater, it is needed. And based on your relationship with God, have it be all for Jesus.
Amen.
So there's a height requirement to the pulpit, and I'm just... So Martin introduced the story of the widow's mite, and I'm convinced in our current American context, the story would have ended a little differently. Because I'm sure someone in the audience would have said, this is why I don't go to church again. He's talking about money. Yeah. And that's the reality. We were uncomfortable talking about money, and so we have the dubious honor of talking about the capital campaign. And it's interesting because in our current culture, has there been a culture more obsessed with money than ours? I mean, everywhere we go, it's the messages, is what you need to have. It's the definition of our social success. It has to do with money, and maybe that's why people are uncomfortable in church. They want to get away from it. Whatever it is, in the Bible, there's a lot of references about money. In the Bible, someone counted, and apparently there are about 500 Bible references that have to do with prayer. There are less than 500 references that have to do with faith. How many references do you think have to do with money? We have 1,000 here. Anyone give me 1,200? 2,000 verses. All of them have to do with money. But in our culture, we're uncomfortable by it. I'm fortunate. My wife and I run an organization, some of you know this, where we facilitate cross-cultural exchanges, where students from our communities travel to the developing world. And not every country has the same relationship with money as we do, and the same kind of fears and apprehensions. I was in the Dominican Republic this was probably 6 or 7 years ago. And we took a group of students from the University of Oregon. And the week had passed, and there were great relationships forming between the students from the University of Oregon and the students from the Dominican Republic. We live in the community, we work side by side with them, and so you really get to know them. And so on about day 5 or 6, we had a question and answer session where we divided the group into about 6 smaller groups of 4 students. And they had a question and answer time with some Dominicans, roughly their age. And so I happened to stumble across this one group of students, and one of the guys from Oregon asked a very typical American question to these Dominicans, and he said, if you were given $1 million, what would you do with it? And I wish he wouldn't have asked that question for a lot of reasons, but he asked the question, and it was a 19-year-old Dominican boy who was getting ready to answer that question, and I was going to intervene and kind of bail him out, but I could tell he wanted to answer it. But there was like about 30 seconds of awkward silence as he's processing through how he's going to answer this question. And finally, he looks behind him at the community, he looks at the people standing next to him from his community, and he says, I guess we figure out what to do with it. We. And that, my American ears could not comprehend that we part of it. Because all of us could answer that question, right? But it would all be how I would spend the money. And if I was going to give it, certainly it wouldn't be a we decision, it would be a me decision. But as I was thinking about that story, because I share that story as we train groups to go and to talk about the difference between our individualistic view of the world and other communities have more of a communal sense of the world. But I thought about it differently. And why I wanted to share it with you is because I think that that's what we are doing as a church. To date, you have pledged about $2 million for the capital campaign. And I just want to pause and celebrate that this morning. About $2 million, and every one of those dollars is a significant sacrifice because that money could easily be going to something to help raise your social status, to buy this or buy that. But instead, people have chosen to give to support the capital campaign. And so, what I like to say is that you guys were all asked, what would you do if you were given $2 million? And you kind of paused, and you said, we'd figure out what to do with it. And I'm proud to be part of this church.
Amen.
Amen.
Good morning. I'm Dan Minch, and I'm following a couple pretty good acts here. Mark with his Queen's English. I'm from Chicago, so I'm going to talk about the Bears or something. And Derek, he shot a three-pointer and scored, so I'm just not tall enough to do that. So, I want to share a couple little stories with you, and then kind of let you know how they relate back. The first one, and I'll be very brief on it because Derek already talked about Courts for Kids, but I'm proud to be able to have attended one about 3 months ago up in Thailand. And we, along with a Jesuit high school in Portland, a bunch of students visited a small village up in northern Thailand near Laos. And it's hard to explain what happened there, but there was a bunch of magic from the day we arrived to a week later. We basically accomplished everything we needed to with building a sport board. And in between there was a whole bunch of magic, the way the high school students interacted, and it was just amazing. But what was truly inspiring for me is this poor village, with all the resources they gave to allow us to be comfortable and feed us. You knew that they did not have those resources, and they made it happen. And getting back to what Derek had mentioned, we're kind of doing the same thing. This village, this Good Shepherd village, is pooling a lot of hard to come by resources to build our court here for future generations. The other story I wanted to share is, I think I shared this a couple years ago with the congregation, but I'll give you the short version of it. My wife is administrator for Cascadia Montessori up the street, and they were dangerously close to being closed a few years ago. I won't get into the details on that, but there was an emergency group created for board members, and I was recruited as treasurer only because I could balance my checkbook, I guess. And nobody wanted to deal with all the bills that were owed and everything. So we actually got to the point where we had a meeting, and it was basically we were going to vote whether to close the school or not because we couldn't make payroll. And we owed the IRS $75,000, and we were in in arrears with the mortgage by a year. It was in really bad shape. And I had looked at the board members and I felt a little guilty, and I said, you know, I don't think that's a decision we should be making. I think that's a decision for the parents of the school to make. And I did the math for the board, and I said, you know, I think we had about $85,000 to make it through the school year for the children to at least be able to, you know, decide what they were going to do next year, or the parents, I should say. And that equated to about $1,000 per student. In some cases, you know, some of the families had more than one student. But these were families who were already paying about $1,000 a month for school, so we were asking them to make one more payment. We gathered the school together, and I guess I wasn't surprised, but they voted to keep the school open, and they pooled their money and made it happen. I felt really good about that, but it was dangerously close to a small school board deciding to close the school, when today that's a thriving school. There's plenty of students there, and it's doing wonderful work. So how I want to relate that back to here is we have about 27% of the congregation, total congregation, that to date has pledged about that $2 million. And so we still have a little ways to go to get to the 3.3 that we're trying to get. But if you break that down to the rest of the congregation, it's about $100 a month for 3 years commitment. And I think it's doable. I know that's not easy for everybody, but instead of looking at this big chunk of money, it's definitely doable for, if we break it down to the level of, I think Martin reminded me that that's about a latte a day, you know, at Starbucks. So it's definitely doable. I want to remind everybody here, as chair of the stewardship committee as well, that in previous years we've done a campaign in October, and this year we elected to merge the two campaigns together for the annual and the capital campaign. And I just want to remind everybody of the timeliness of getting the pledges in, certainly on the annual, because we have budgets to create, and we have some work to do on the financial side with those pledges. And then, of course, you know, as soon as we can get your pledges in for the capital campaign, we'd like to, you know, get some commitments and go to the bank, because I think we'd like to break ground here early next year if we can, because we want this excitement to keep going. And I believe that once we break ground, we can see some of the fruits of what we're doing here. So I'd like to finish with today's psalm. It's very timely, I'll say, and I won't sing it, but it's, unless the Lord builds the house, their labor is in vain